Hello, everybody, and thank you for tuning in to the Liberty Report. Today is Friday, and we do Mythbusters, and co-host is Chris Rossini. Chris, what do you have in store for today?
Good morning, Dr. Paul. Well, this week, Department of Energy head Rick Perry suggested an economic principle, and he received a lot of flack for it, maybe a lot of it because it had to do with coal. But we'll discuss those criticisms, and we'll see if it was warranted against them. But before getting to what Perry said, let's cover a very simple, basic economic principle, and that's wants versus real demands. Now, we all have unlimited wants, and unfortunately, a lot of people think that because they want it, that they have a right to something. But there was a French economist from the 19th century who said that production is the source of demand. What did he mean by that?
Well, it sounds pretty simple, and I think that it's been cited many times over the years about this concern about how you provide goods and services to the general public. And Say's came up with emphasizing supply. But Keynes came along and sort of made use of it, made fun of it, and said supply has nothing to do with it. But they had simplified Say's law. Say's the one who designed this law, and says that the people who didn't want it because it was a restriction on government, they said that no, it's silly to believe that supply creates all these demands, and they say that demands are very important. But you know, in the 17th century and 18th century, the economists struggled over the marketplace. Why were there ups and downs in the business cycle and this sort of thing? And the two things they argued about was, you know, when the economy dipped down, they said, well, people don't have enough money, that's why they're not buying stuff. So that was one argument. And then the other argument was that there was too much production and people didn't want the stuff anymore, and therefore the market had to adjust, and then you had slumps. Well, Adam Smith came along, and he sort of dispelled the concern about you know, that there's a lack of money, and he explained that pretty well to the point where many economists since then, up until the Keynesian revolution, understood that it wasn't a scarcity of money, it was a scarcity of the invisible hand being allowed to run the economy. And that's when Say's comes in, and he comes in and talks about you know, supply, and that if you have a supply of something, it does create demand, but it's not so simple as to say if you have something, people are always going to buy it and the price will come down. And obviously, you know, if you overproduce and it is more than the consumer wants or something the consumers don't want, it doesn't satisfy those needs. But if the businessman who is responsible for putting stuff out there, if he is a wise businessman and makes the choices and provides goods and services at the right price on the things that the customers, the consumers will want, then they give him money for this. Now, what Say says is that's not the end of it at all, because the businessman make a decision, the consumers make a decision, but once the businessman gets the money, he buys stuff. So in a way, production creates the demand, not the demand to get rid of his stuff if it's the wrong thing. But what he emphasized is that the businessman, the entrepreneur, has to be pretty sharp. If it's a new product, he has to talk the consumer into wanting it. If he has a commodity that is well known and you overproduce it, you know, that just automatically won't be consumed. There's always some limits. So I see Say's as coming along and supporting, you know, the basic principles that Adam Smith was talking about, and explaining how this invisible hand works. And this point I think is very important, is that if a businessman sells something, he provides the supply and goes out and he does a satisfactory job, and the consumer gives him money, that isn't the end of it. That's just the middle of it. And the money is the facilitator. The money, you know, is the medium of exchange. But once the businessman gets the money, the sole purpose isn't just to get the money. and sit on it, the businessman say, now I can buy new products, I can do new things, I can do some more investigation and investments and this sort of thing. So that was his argument, but that argument sort of got changed because it de-emphasized the government. First, Adam Smith, believe it or not, we had inflation back in those days. Adam Smith says it isn't up to the government just to create money and all of a sudden have a healthy economy, and the economists agreed with that. But then Sayes comes along and says that you have to leave the market alone. You can't artificially get involved in creating demands, because that's when we get off track, and that justifies all the bad things that have been going on. It's Keynesian economics, it's interventionism, it's the belief that government not only has to create the money, they have to set the interest rate and set prices and believe, and they make decisions. They'll say, people should have houses, so we'll direct the people to make houses and we'll provide the money and say, build houses. And everybody knows in recent years, that doesn't work. It causes bubbles and distortions. So the information is available from way back into the early part of the 19th century that the importance of money and also the importance of allow the market to work, can solve a lot of these problems. And actually, it ushered in an age of, free market economics where we have had great prosperity. But the challenge has come, of course, in the 20th century, because there are still those who are challenging this, because if the free market people win out, it severely limits the government. It destroys the principles of central banking. It destroys the principles of central economic planning. It explains, why socialism doesn't work. And this is what the Austrian economists, the free market people that we follow now, they inherited those convictions, and they've even modified them and improved them over the 20th century and even today. But the battle continues. The Keynesians are out there, and they have to destroy it because they want to be in charge no matter what the evidence is. They want to defend the position that government is needed, the bureaucrats are needed, spending is needed, and of course they had to add into this, deficits don't matter. And this is what brought us today. So even though intellectually the free market and sound money wins out, and Sayes is correct, and Adam Smith is correct, actually Keynes has been winning out because even before Keynes wrote his book in the 1930s, the government was already leaving that, but Keynes came along and justified all this monkeying around with the money supply and government economic planning. And this is important, because if we ever want to get out of our mess, we have to know which principles we're going to defend. But if we go back to Adam Smith and Sayes and understand what they are saying and refute and convince the people that Keynes was absolutely off the track, and yet right now the principal economic philosophy of Washington, D.C. and central banking all supports basically what Keynes was saying. That has to be refuted.
Yes, next we'll talk about what Rick Perry actually said and caused the brouhaha. And he said, here's a little economics lesson, supply and demand. You put the supply out there, meaning coal, and the demand will follow. Now, what's right and wrong about that statement, Dr. Paul?
Well, Rick Perry's on the right side of the general principle, but his understanding and his representation of it fell into the trap of the liberals mocking him. Of course, he set himself up, and they started making fun. And most people, as a matter of fact, that's not what Sayes says. He doesn't say that, well, if there's coal out there and all you have to do is produce as much coal as you want and there will always be consumers. He didn't say that. He said what I indicated earlier, that you have to make wise decisions, wise productions, and consumers have to make decisions, and the consumer is king, and they guide it. They become the invisible hand. But what Rick Perry said indicated that it sounded like, oh, no matter what you have, if you just produce it, there's always going to be a market out there, which, people sort of laugh at. That's not true. But Sayes did not say that. But for the most part, most people today sort of repeat the definition of Say's laws by citing the Keynesian explanation of it. So what is needed is a proper explanation of what Say says in Say's law, and that is it's much more difficult of that it keeps the cycle going with the absence of government interference. So, but they did jump all over Rick Perry and made fun of him, said he was just from Texas and all this. But the truth is, he was closer to being right than the critics. The critics are absolutely wrong. They're motivated by, a very bad economic system. They're motivated by justifying big government. Rick was trying to use a free market principle to defend his position, but there was a little bit of a twist there where he fell into the trap of using the Keynesian's definition of the supply and demand that it drives the marketplace. So he got a lot of grief over it, but all I would like to do is make sure we can get as many people as possible to understand how the markets work, how far along we have come since prior to Adam Smith's days, and how much advancement we had in the 19th century, and the challenges we faced in the 20th century, where Keynes has sort of ruled out, and not intellectually, he has not refuted anything of Say's laws and Ricardo and Adam Smith, but politically he has, because it was sort of a godsend to the politician. You mean if we listen to Keynes, he can justify spending and deficits and interference and bureaucracy, and then we become powerful, influential, important people, and then our universities became saturated with that. So intellectually, it's a regression. The 20th century is basically a regression in economic understanding, but not by the intellectuals who have remained true. And those are the Austrian economists led by Mises and others, because they understood this much better. And there's no reason in the world why we can't eventually win this, because what we're seeing is the end stages of this so-called victory of the Keynesians. And look at the mess we have. We have so much debt and malinvestment and the mess and the size of the government and the militarism. It's all a consequence of not understanding and justifying this. The biggest problem that we have had is that in the early stages of just printing money, or in the early stages of telling the people, we're going to give you houses, it looks pretty good. Print money, that's good. The wages go up, and oh yeah, we can buy a house. Interest rates are low. But what they don't tell you, in time, it collapsed, and the housing bubble collapsed. Well, we're back doing the same thing again. So everything in a way is a bubble, and the currency situation is in a bubble. And that's why there's not room for optimism about the current system, but there's room for optimism that we know the answer, we understand the answer. And thank goodness there are enough people out there teaching the right kind of economics, but so far you're not going to find a whole lot of that in state-run university, and it's obvious why, because they're dependent on Keynesian economics to get their funding, get their research money, and get their high salaries and build their building. So they cannot challenge this. They cannot be objective in discussing economic policy.
Yes, next let's talk about how central bankers have ruined these economic principles and created the mess that we're in. As we stated earlier, demand is not simply because you want something and then government has to provide it to you. Demand is, as Say said, you have to produce something first, whether it be a product or service or your labor, and you trade production. Well, the central bankers and politicians instead viewed demand as a monetary issue, where they would just print new money and hand it out, and that could act as demand. What's wrong with that, Dr.?
Well, it doesn't work. That's the main reason. Emphasizing production is important. And how do you get production? Well, it's the principle of private property rights, incentives to earn money and make a living, and incentive, and the strongest voice is the consumer, picking out and choosing which goods they'll buy and which goods they will refuse to buy. And so you need free markets, you need property rights, you need contract rights, you need sound money as the medium of exchange, because all we're doing, what Say was sorting this all out, and Adam Smith, is how do goods and services services get transferred back and forth. Originally, of course, it was all barter. This is modernized bartering, because instead of thinking, well, I have this product and I want money, and that's all there is to it. No, it's more complicated than this. You have to have people produce for a reason. And the people who can anticipate and understand what the consumers want, they're successful, and then they create more demand. And that's what makes the whole economy go around. But the people who don't like this are the ones who want to have central banking, because they serve the special interest. And I think the most important lesson from all this today in a political sense is when you follow that Keynesian principle and deficits and central banking, what you do is you literally destroy the middle class. And what is the big issue today? It's the accumulation of massive wealth by the few at the expense of the middle class. And I think there's one basic rule of that. The person or the group or the institution that creates the money is very powerful, mostly because they have the power and the authority to distribute that money. So they create it, they distribute it, and who gets it? The bankers get it, the military-industrial complex get it, the bureaucrats benefit, and certain industries, medical industry, education, but it doesn't provide a wise choice. It isn't a consumer choice, and there's no market there, and therefore all it does is distort, and you end up with shortages in one area and excesses in the other area. So today we have massive excesses in one group of people and shortages in another. We literally live in a time where there are two groups, those who have and those who don't have, and the group who don't have are more aggressive, and unfortunately what they say is, oh, this is all because my rights are being violated, and I have a right to be taken care of. I have a right to medical care and free education and on and on. So they make the so-called moral excuse for perpetuating this fraud. And then they come in and they get control of the government. Now, the worst part about it is the conclusion of this, because it usually ends in disaster. The only benefit there is that that's the time then people can come to their senses and decide, well, it didn't work. Communism and fascism of the ruthless kind of the 20th century came to an end badly after killing hundreds of millions of people, and at least they moved away from the ruthlessness, but it's still out there. Ideologically, it's still out there of using force to redistribute wealth. So in one sense, it's coming to an end. If we did the right thing, we could work our way out of it. The odds of that happening are probably zero, and therefore our goal has to be for education, for people to understand intellectually why liberty works and why we have to defend liberty, and not be ridiculed for defending private property as becoming selfish. And that's why I saw what they did to Rick Perry as detrimental, because they weren't picking and choosing because he misquoted somebody and he was really trying to defend the marketplace because he's basically a free market guy. So that is the big challenge that we have, and that is what happens is they're belittling those individuals because they grab the moral high ground. Oh, you don't care about somebody who's sick and they're not going to get medical care. Yeah, we care about people who are sick and don't get medical care. That's why we don't like the medical care system in Venezuela and Zimbabwe and most of the world. And what's coming in this country too. So they say, well, it doesn't work very well here. That means the free market doesn't work. Well, that's a bunch of baloney. We haven't had a free market. So the problems here so often politically is they blame the free market when they should be blaming crony capitalism, Keynesianism, central banking, justification for deficit financing. That's where the real harm is, and we have to emphasize productivity and convince the people that productivity is just not a static instrument. You produce and they buy, and we'll tell them what to buy. It doesn't work like that. That only happens under communism, and that's why you had excesses in communism and socialism, and you have shortages. It's only in the marketplace. It never has perfection, but the market works on that, the supply and demand and the consumer. But ultimately, the freer the market, the more powerful the individual is. That's the only true democracy that should be permitted. The consumer having the right to decide the wages of company, and the consumer having the right to determine whether a company should succeed or not. And it should never be designed that people have a right to something, and banks and corporations don't have a right to be bailed out. So is quite a bit different than we have, but we have to be emphatic on the principles that we believe in.
Yeah, so finally, the major challenge that we're battling here is ideas. And unfortunately, we have about half of the American population that is on some form of federal assistance. They're on the dole. And you can't help but get into an entitlement trap in your thinking that you have a right to these things. So if you could close out the show by explaining why there needs to be a reemergence of self-responsibility and desire to trade something for something instead of getting something for nothing.
Yeah, and I think that something for something is important. This is modern day bartering that is efficient, and now internationally it's very efficient. So the efficiency of the remaining part of our market is amazing, what it can produce and take care of. But because of the interference, that usually comes down, mainly because of the overburden of debt. But I think you've touched on the important principle, and what is a right? Do you have a right to medical care? And do you have a right to get stuff from the government? But they never ask whose right has to be violated in order to get this. But they don't want to talk about that because that diminishes the authority of the politician, because he's in the business of gaining power, and he earns his keep along the way by being the distributor of these funds. So that is the important thing, basically understanding rights. If we come to money and freedom of choice and decisions, a lot of people can't quite understand. I have a lot of progressive friends that I've debated this issue with, and they'd be, oh yeah, I like your foreign policy. We shouldn't be fighting all these wars. Yes, I like your basic principle that people should have their privacy and their religious and sexual life is their own as long as they don't hurt people. But when it comes to property, this is a different story, and therefore free enterprise is very destructive because it's selfish, and it helps one group versus another. It is true in a free market there will be wealthier people than others, but it would be a lot less confrontational than the inequalities that we put up with today. They can't possibly defend what's happening today, so they defend that. But I think it basically, the most important thing is property and private contract rights. And if you defend property and contract and voluntarism and a principle of non-aggression, believe me, you don't need a whole lot more laws, and we would be a much more wealthier nation. And that, of course, is what I have always strived for to present, and that's why there's a growing number of people. There's a growing number of people who accept Austrian economics. And groups, and there's now more progressives talking about the reasons we ought not to be in these wars. I think we're making a lot of progress intellectually. We have a ways to go to really influence the politicians. And Chris, I want to thank you for being with us today on this program.
Great to be with you again, Dr. Paul.
Good. And I want to thank our audience for joining us today. This might be a little bit esoteric, but I think it's very important. I think it's fascinating. And I think when I discovered Austrian economics to help explain these things, I was just amazed because I had been introduced to some economic courses that were Keynesian and mathematical, and that you had to be a mathematical genius to predict what's going to happen, to figure out, well, if we do this, and they had these massive equations, and they still do this, as if they can understand what the consumer wants and what he doesn't want. So you can get rid of all those computers, all those calculations, and boil it down to what human action is all about, what the consumer wants and how the entrepreneur will adjust so that he can make a profit, so that he can provide more supply and more demand and let the system work. I want to thank everybody for tuning in today to the Liberty Report. Please come back soon.